A new journey begins. The vibrant hum of Los Angeles International Airport was a tapestry of movement, sound, and purpose. Among the sea of travelers, a striking pair walked purposefully toward their gate. Marcus Bradley, a tall, confident man in his mid-40s, exuded a quiet authority in his impeccably tailored Navy suit. Beside him, his 7-year-old daughter, Leela, bounced with youthful energy, her red curls bouncing as she gripped her father's hand tightly. "Daddy, is that our plane?" Lila's voice was a mix of excitement and awe as she pointed to a sleek aircraft with an emblem of golden wings painted on its tail. Marcus glanced at the plane and then at his daughter, smiling. "That's the one, sweetheart. Are you ready for your first big trip with me?" Leela nodded enthusiastically, her blue eyes sparkling. "I've been ready forever." Marcus chuckled and adjusted the straps of her tiny pink backpack. This was no ordinary trip for Marcus. He was the CEO of Pegasus Airlines, a thriving international airline that he had built from the ground up. Today, however, he was just a father, taking his daughter on her first business trip. The timing was serendipitous. It coincided with her school break, and she had begged to join him. Despite his busy schedule, Marcus wanted to nurture her curiosity and give her a glimpse of his world. As they approached the priority boarding line, Marcus knelt to Leila's level. "Remember what we talked about. Best behavior, indoor voice, and don't hesitate to ask for help if you need it." "Yes, Daddy." Leela beamed, her small hands gripping her stuffed rabbit, Ruby, tightly. "And if I need anything, I'll ask the flight attendant politely." "That's my girl." Marcus kissed her forehead before straightening up and presenting their boarding passes to the attendant. "Good morning, Mr. Bradley," the flight attendant greeted, her eyes widening slightly as she recognized him. "It's an honor to have you on board." "Thank you," Marcus replied warmly, ushering Leela forward. "This is my daughter, Leela. It's her first trip, so please take good care of her." The attendant's demeanor softened as she knelt to Leila's level. "Well, aren't you a lucky young lady to be flying with us today? Welcome aboard, Miss Leila." Leela giggled shyly and tucked herself closer to Marcus. They were escorted to the first-class cabin, where Marcus helped Leila settle into her window seat. He adjusted her seatbelt and placed Ruby on her lap. "Now I'll be in the meeting for a bit in the business section," Marcus explained, crouching beside her. "But I'll check on you often, okay? If you need anything, Miss Anna here will help you." Leela nodded but held her father's hand a moment longer. "Don't be too long, okay?" "I promise," Marcus reassured her. He stood and spoke briefly with Anna, requesting her to look after Leila. "She might get nervous during takeoff. Please make sure she's comfortable." "Absolutely, Mr. Bradley," Anna replied. Her professional smile and gentle demeanor seemed reassuring. Satisfied, Marcus gave Leila one last hug before heading to the business-class cabin. Leila turned her attention to the window, her excitement bubbling as the plane prepared for takeoff. She watched ground crews scurry like ants below and marveled at the plane's taxiing to the runway. As the engines roared to life, Leila clutched Ruby and leaned back into her seat, her heart racing with excitement. She barely noticed when Anna reappeared, kneeling beside her. "Are you all right, Leila?" Anna asked gently. "Would you like some water?" Leila nodded, feeling the dryness in her throat as the plane began to ascend. Anna handed her a small bottle of water and stayed for a moment, her demeanor kind and attentive. Feeling a bit more at ease, Leila sipped her water and turned back to the view outside her window. The city shrank below her as clouds enveloped the plane in their cottony embrace. As the plane leveled off, Anna brought Leila a small tray of snacks, complete with crackers, cheese, and fruit. "Here you go, Leila. Your dad wanted to make sure you had something to nibble on." "Thank you, Miss Anna," Leila said with a polite smile, her manners a reflection of the values Marcus had instilled in her. Anna smiled back warmly before moving on to assist other passengers. Leila nibbled on the snacks while flipping through a colorful book her father had packed for her. The time passed quickly, and she felt more comfortable with every passing moment. Occasionally, Anna stopped by to check on her, offering small comforts like a pillow or adjusting her blanket. Other passengers smiled at the young girl, charmed by her polite demeanor and obvious excitement about the adventure. In the business cabin, Marcus wrapped up his presentation to the investors. He checked his watch and decided to head back to check on Leela. When he reached the first-class cabin, he found her deep in conversation with Anna, who was showing her how to fold napkins into intricate shapes. "How's my favorite traveler?" Marcus asked as he approached, his voice full of warmth. Leela's face lit up. "Daddy, look what Miss Anna taught me." She proudly displayed a napkin folded into the shape of a swan. Marcus smiled, gratitude evident in his eyes as he looked at Anna. "Thank you for taking such good care of her." "It's been my pleasure," Anna replied. "She's a wonderful little passenger." Relieved, Marcus kissed Leela on the head. "I have to head back to my meeting, but I'll be back soon." "Okay." "Okay, Daddy," Leela said, already engrossed in folding another napkin. As Marcus returned to his meeting, he felt a sense of contentment. His little girl was in good hands, and for the moment, everything seemed to be going smoothly. What he didn't realize was that this journey would soon take an unexpected turn, testing his values and his resolve as both a father and a leader. Shadows beneath the clouds. The hum of the engines filled the first-class cabin with a soothing rhythm as the plane cruised above the clouds. Leela, now comfortable with her surroundings, busied herself folding napkins into tiny swans and stars. Her stuffed rabbit, Ruby, sat propped against the window, watching the sky outside. Everything seemed perfect, at least for the moment. The encounter with Sarah. Not long after Marcus had returned to the business section, a second flight attendant, Sarah, entered the first-class cabin. Sarah was tall, with dark hair neatly tied back into a bun, and an air of sharp efficiency about her. She approached Anna, who was adjusting a blanket for another passenger, and whispered something into her ear. Anna's face briefly clouded before she nodded, relinquishing her duties to Sarah. Sarah moved with an air of quiet authority as she took over the first-class service. When she reached Lila's row, her expression shifted slightly. The faintest shadow crossed her face, though her professional demeanor remained intact. "Hello, young lady," Sarah said, crouching to Lila's eye level. "Is there anything you need?" Lila glanced up, her initial excitement now replaced with a touch of apprehension. "No, thank you," she replied softly, clutching Ruby to her chest. Sarah's smile was tight, her eyes flicking briefly toward the plush rabbit. "Let me know if you need anything," she said before standing and walking away. Subtle disturbances. As Sarah moved about the cabin, her interactions with other passengers were polished and courteous. Yet, when she passed Leela, her tone and demeanor seemed to shift slightly, becoming clipped, impatient. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it wasn't lost on Leela. She began to feel small, as if she were doing something wrong just by sitting there. During the meal service, Sarah placed plates of food in front of the other first-class passengers with care. When she reached Leela, she set the tray down with an audible clatter. A bit of soup sloshed over the edge of the bowl. "Careful," Sarah said, her voice sharp. "Don't spill it." Leela nodded, her excitement over the meal dimming. She adjusted her tray carefully, making sure not to upset anything. She wasn't used to being treated like this. Her father had always taught her to be kind, and in her short life, most adults had reciprocated that kindness. A small request. Midway through the flight, Leela felt thirsty again. She hesitated, but remembering her father's advice to use her manners, she pressed the call button. Moments later, Sarah appeared, her expression neutral. "Yes," Sarah asked. "Could I please have some water?" Leela asked, her voice polite but hesitant. Sarah sighed audibly. "Water service isn't available right now," she said curtly. "You'll have to wait." With that, she turned and walked away. Lila bit her lip, feeling a lump form in her throat. She wasn't sure what she'd done to upset Sarah, but the flight attendant's attitude left her feeling uneasy. Small acts of kindness. The older woman sitting across the aisle had been observing the interaction. Her name was Mrs. Hathaway, a retired school teacher with a warm smile and an affinity for children. She leaned toward Leela, her voice soft. "Sweetheart, are you all right?" Mrs. Hathaway asked. Leela looked up, her eyes wide. She nodded quickly, not wanting to cause any trouble. "I'm okay," she whispered. Mrs. Hathaway frowned, her gaze following Sarah as the flight attendant continued down the aisle. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small pack of cookies. "Here," she said, placing them on Leela's tray. "In case you get hungry." Leela's face brightened slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. As Leela nibbled on a cookie, Mrs. Hathaway shot a pointed look at Sarah, who pretended not to notice. The tension in the cabin was palpable, though most passengers were oblivious to it, an escalating pattern. As the flight continued, Sarah's subtle mistreatment of Leela became more apparent. She ignored her requests, scolded her for minor actions like adjusting her seat, and even muttered under her breath about children being spoiled. Leela, unsure how to handle the situation, remained quiet, hoping her father would return soon. At one point, Sarah passed by and noticed Ruby sitting on the seat beside Leela. She picked up the stuffed rabbit, holding it up as if it were an object of disdain. "You shouldn't leave things lying around," Sarah said, dropping Ruby unceremoniously onto Lila's lap. Leela's cheeks burned with embarrassment. She hugged Ruby tightly, fighting back tears. Why was this happening? She hadn't done anything wrong. Marcus's return. Meanwhile, in the business section, Marcus was finishing up his meeting. He glanced at his watch and realized he'd been gone longer than he'd intended. A pang of guilt struck him as he thought about Leela sitting alone in first class. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Marcus said, rising from his seat. "I need to check on my daughter." As he walked toward the first-class cabin, Marcus noticed the atmosphere shift. Passengers who recognized him nodded politely, but a sense of unease settled in his chest. When he reached Lila's seat, the sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. Leela was sitting stiffly, her cheeks streaked with dried tears. Ruby was clutched tightly in her arms, and her tray was covered in crumbs from the cookies Mrs. Hathaway had given her. She looked up at her father, her blue eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Sweetheart," Marcus said softly, kneeling beside her. "What's wrong?" Leela hesitated, glancing toward Sarah, who was standing near the galley. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed slightly, a silent warning. I'm okay, Daddy," Leela said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus frowned. His daughter's demeanor was completely different from when he had left her. Something was wrong, and he intended to find out what. Did something happen? He pressed gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Leela hesitated again, her small hands tightening around Ruby. I don't like her," she finally admitted, glancing toward Sarah. Marcus's jaw tightened as he followed her gaze. He didn't need to ask who her referred to. Rising to his full height, he approached Sarah, his expression calm but steely. "Excuse me," he said, his tone firm. "Can we talk?" Sarah turned, her professional smile plastered on her face. "Of course, Mr. Bradley. Is there an issue?" Marcus gestured toward Leela. "My daughter seems upset. I'd like to know why." Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. "I assure you, Mr. Bradley, everything is fine. Your daughter has been a bit demanding, but I've been managing it." Marcus's eyes narrowed. He wasn't a man who jumped to conclusions, but something about Sarah's demeanor didn't sit right with him. He turned back to Leela, who was watching the interaction nervously. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "you can tell me anything. Did something happen?" Leela glanced at Sarah again, fear flickering in her eyes. I don't want to get in trouble," she whispered. Marcus's heart clenched. Whatever had happened, it was serious enough to make his normally brave daughter afraid. He crouched beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not in trouble, Leela," he said softly. "And no one will hurt you, I promise." As he spoke, a storm began brewing within him. Whatever had caused his daughter to feel this way, he was determined to uncover it and ensure it never happened again. Unveiling the truth. The tension in the first-class cabin was palpable as Marcus knelt beside Lila. The sight of his usually spirited daughter reduced to a fearful, subdued version of herself sent a surge of protective anger through him. His mind raced with questions, but he kept his voice calm and steady for her sake. "Princess," he said softly, tilting her chin so she would look at him, "I need you to tell me what's wrong. Did someone say or do something to upset you?" Leela hesitated, her fingers nervously fidgeting with Ruby's soft ears. She glanced toward Sarah, who stood stiffly a few rows away, her face a mask of practiced indifference. Lila's gaze darted back to her father, her small body trembling as if torn between fear and the need to confide in him. I don't want to get anyone in trouble," she whispered, tears welling up in her blue eyes. Marcus's heart ached, but his resolve hardened. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You won't be in trouble, sweetheart. And you won't get anyone in trouble for telling the truth. I promise. You can trust me." Leela hesitated a moment longer, then took a deep breath as if summoning every ounce of courage. Her voice was barely audible as she spoke. She said I shouldn't touch things, and she called me spoiled. She wouldn't give me water when I was thirsty, and she squeezed my arm really hard." Marcus's face darkened. "She who?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Leela glanced toward Sarah again, her hand tightening around Ruby. "The other flight attendant," she whispered. "Confrontation begins." Marcus straightened, his calm veneer cracking just enough to reveal the storm brewing beneath. He turned toward Sarah, who was now visibly uncomfortable under his gaze. "Miss." Marcus glanced at her name tag, Sarah. "May I have a word with you?" Sarah's professional smile faltered for a moment before she recovered. "Of course, Mr. Bradley," she said, stepping closer. "Is there a problem?" Marcus took a deep breath, reining in his anger. "Yes, there is. My daughter has just told me that you've been unkind to her during this flight. She says you refused her water, criticized her, and even hurt her physically. I need an explanation." Sarah's expression shifted from discomfort to indignation. "Sir, with all due respect, children can sometimes misunderstand situations. I assure you, I've treated your daughter with the same professionalism and care as I do all our passengers." "Misunderstand," Marcus repeated, his voice dangerously low. "Are you implying my daughter fabricated the red marks on her arm?" Sarah's eyes darted to Leela, who was now sitting quietly, clutching Ruby. She seemed to weigh her options before responding. I didn't mean to hurt her," Sarah said, her voice defensive. "She was being difficult, and I may have grabbed her arm to prevent her from touching the controls. It was purely for her safety." Marcus took a step closer, his towering presence amplifying the authority in his voice. "Let me make something very clear. There is no excuse, none, for putting your hands on a child. Ever. Especially one under your care, and refusing her basic necessities like water. That's not just unprofessional, it's cruel. Witnesses, speak up." The heated exchange caught the attention of other passengers in the first-class cabin. Mrs. Hathaway, who had been quietly observing the scene, finally spoke up. "Excuse me, sir," she said, leaning forward. "If I may, I saw the way this young lady was treated. The attendant was dismissive and harsh with her the entire flight. I even offered my own meal to the child because she was hungry, but the attendant refused to allow it." A businessman seated across the aisle added, "I noticed it too." The little girl pressed the call button earlier, and the response was, "Let's just say less than professional." Sarah's face turned pale as murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. Passengers who had remained silent earlier now began sharing their observations, painting a damning picture of Sarah's behavior. The captain intervenes. The commotion reached the cockpit, and Captain Reynolds, a seasoned pilot with over 2 decades of experience, emerged to investigate. He quickly assessed the situation, his sharp eyes taking in Marcus's controlled fury, Lila's tear-streaked face, and the guilty expression on Sarah's face. "Mr. Bradley," the captain said, his voice calm but firm, "what seems to be the issue?" Marcus turned to the captain, his voice steady but laden with authority. "Captain, I entrusted my daughter to the care of your crew. Instead, she was mistreated and physically hurt by this flight attendant. I want an explanation and immediate action." The captain's jaw tightened as he turned to Sarah. "Is this true?" "Captain," Sarah began, her voice shaky, "I didn't mean to harm the child. It was a misunderstanding. She was being disruptive." "Disruptive?" Marcus interjected, his tone sharp. "My daughter is 7 years old and was sitting quietly with her stuffed rabbit. The only disruption here is your behavior." The captain raised a hand to silence further argument. "Enough. Sarah, step into the galley." Now, the aftermath. As Sarah retreated to the galley, the captain knelt beside Lila, his expression softening. "Young lady, I'm so sorry for what you've experienced on this flight. I promise you, this is not how we treat our passengers, especially someone as special as you." Lila nodded timidly, her fingers still gripping Ruby tightly. Marcus placed a protective arm around her shoulders. The captain straightened and addressed Marcus. "Mr. Bradley, rest assured that this incident will be thoroughly investigated. In the meantime, I'll assign another crew member to oversee your daughter's comfort for the remainder of the flight." "Thank you, Captain," Marcus said, his voice tight. "But this goes beyond comfort. There's a systemic issue here, and I intend to address it, personally." The captain nodded gravely. "Understood, sir." A quiet resolve. As the captain returned to the cockpit and a new attendant took over, the first-class cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Marcus pulled Lila into his lap, holding her close as she rested her head against his chest. "Daddy," she whispered after a long silence. "Yes, sweetheart. Did I do something wrong?" Marcus's heart broke at her question. He tilted her chin up so she could see the sincerity in his eyes. "No, Layla, you did nothing wrong. Sometimes, people are mean for reasons that have nothing to do with you. But I promise you this, no one has the right to treat you that way. Ever." Leela nodded, a small smile forming as she leaned back into his embrace. For the rest of the flight, Marcus sat with his daughter, his mind already planning the changes he would implement to ensure no child or passenger would ever endure what Leela had. In his world, justice wasn't optional, it was a necessity. Justice takes flight. The plane continued its journey at cruising altitude, but the atmosphere in the first-class cabin was far from tranquil. Marcus Bradley, still holding Leela protectively in his arms, watched as the situation began to unfold in ways that would demand action far beyond this single flight. His daughter's earlier fear was now slowly being replaced by the security of her father's presence, but the bruises on her arm and the shadows in her eyes fueled a fire in Marcus's heart that he could not ignore. Behind the curtain, in the galley, Sarah sat rigidly on a jump seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The air marshal assigned to the flight stood nearby, ensuring she didn't leave her position. Her once composed demeanor had crumbled, replaced by a pale, tense expression as the weight of her actions began to sink in. She knew who Marcus Bradley was now, the CEO of the very airline she worked for. But it wasn't just his title that unnerved her. It was the unshakable authority and righteous anger in his voice that left her trembling. The captain entered the galley, his expression a mask of professionalism hiding the simmering frustration beneath. "Sarah," he began, his voice low and firm, "you've put this entire flight crew in a compromising position with your actions. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" "It was a misunderstanding, Captain," Sarah stammered, her voice cracking. "The child was difficult, and I might have been too firm, but..." The captain raised a hand to silence her. "This isn't a debate. We've had multiple complaints from passengers who witnessed your behavior. I'll remind you that we're not just employees of Pegasus Airlines. We're representatives of its values. And today, you've violated every one of them." Sarah opened her mouth as if to argue, but quickly thought better of it. She slumped back against the seat, resigned to her fate. A father's quiet fury. Back in the cabin, Marcus placed a soft kiss on Layla's forehead before signaling to the newly assigned flight attendant. "Can you bring some juice and a snack for my daughter?" he asked. "She hasn't eaten properly." "Right away, Mr. Bradley," the attendant replied, her tone full of genuine concern. As the attendant left, Mrs. Hathaway leaned over from her seat. "Mr. Bradley," she said softly, "if I may. I've been a teacher for over 40 years, and I've seen many children endure things they shouldn't. Your daughter is brave. She didn't deserve any of this, and I hope you know you're handling this situation with grace." Marcus gave her a small, grateful nod. "Thank you," he replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "I appreciate your kindness, and I'll make sure my daughter knows she's not alone." Mrs. Hathaway smiled warmly and returned to her seat, allowing Marcus a moment to collect himself. He turned back to Leela, who was now sipping her juice and nibbling on crackers. Her small smile was a welcome sight, but Marcus knew the real work was just beginning. The investigation begins. As the plane began its descent toward Dallas International Airport, Marcus requested a private conversation with Captain Reynolds. They met in the small space near the cockpit, away from the other passengers. "Captain," Marcus began, his voice steady but firm, "I need a full documented account of what's happened on this flight. I'll want statements from every witness, including your crew." The captain nodded. "Of course, Mr. Bradley. I've already informed ground operations. Security and a legal representative will meet us at the gate. I've also arranged for a customer service team to assist you and your daughter." Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line. "Thank you, Captain. But this goes deeper than just one incident. This isn't just about my daughter. This is about ensuring that no one else faces this kind of treatment on my airline. I want to see immediate changes to our hiring and training protocols. I'll work directly with HR and operations to implement them." The captain's respect for Marcus deepened as he listened. "Understood, sir. I'll do everything in my power to support you." Landing in the spotlight. When the plane touched down, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers remained seated as instructed, but their eyes darted toward Marcus and Leela, aware that something significant was unfolding. The plane taxied to the gate, and the door opened to reveal a group of officials waiting on the jet bridge. Security personnel boarded first, escorting Sarah off the plane under the watchful gaze of the passengers. As she passed by Marcus and Leela, Sarah's eyes darted toward the ground, unable to meet their gaze. The murmurs of disapproval from the other passengers followed her down the aisle. Mrs. Hathaway leaned toward Leela and whispered, "You're very brave, my dear. Remember that." Layla gave her a small, shy smile in return. Marcus stood and lifted Leela into his arms, shielding her from the prying eyes of the crowd as they disembarked. He was greeted by a member of the airline's customer service team, who guided them toward a private lounge away from the bustling terminal. Taking the stand. In the lounge, Marcus held Leela close as a team of lawyers, airline executives, and PR representatives gathered around him. One of the executives, a middle-aged man named Alan Grant, stepped forward. "Mr. Bradley," Alan began, his tone filled with regret, "I want to personally apologize for what happened on this flight. This kind of behavior is unacceptable and does not reflect the values of Pegasus Airlines." "An apology is a start," Marcus replied, his voice calm but resolute. "But actions speak louder than words. I want immediate reforms. We'll implement stricter screening processes for employees, mandatory sensitivity training, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination or abuse of any kind." Ellen nodded fervently. "We'll begin drafting those policies immediately, and Sarah's employment will be terminated as of today." "Good," Marcus said. And I want this incident used as a case study in training sessions going forward. Every employee needs to understand that this behavior will not be tolerated. Healing together. As the executives began to organize their response, Marcus turned his full attention back to Leela. He crouched to her level, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "Leela," he said softly, "I'm so proud of you. You were brave and strong, even when things were hard. And I promise you, I'll make sure this never happens again. Not to you, not to anyone." Leela's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief. She wrapped her arms around her father's neck, holding him tightly. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered. "I love you too, Princess," Marcus replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'll always protect you." In that moment, Marcus vowed not only to safeguard his daughter's happiness, but to use his influence to create lasting change. For him, this wasn't just about justice for Leela. It was about ensuring that Pegasus Airlines remained a symbol of safety, respect, and dignity for every passenger who stepped aboard. Rebuilding trust. The soft hum of the private lounge at Dallas International Airport provided a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the first-class cabin just hours earlier. Marcus sat on a plush sofa, Leela curled up next to him with her stuffed rabbit, Ruby, cradled in her arms. The bruises on her small arm were a painful reminder of what had transpired, and Marcus found himself alternating between anger and resolve. A senior airline executive, Alan Grant, stood before Marcus, flanked by a legal representative and the head of the airline's HR department. They had spent the last 30 minutes briefing Marcus on the immediate steps they were taking to address the situation. Despite their efforts to reassure him, Marcus remained steadfast and unimpressed. "This isn't just about my daughter," Marcus began, his voice calm but steely. "This is about every child, every passenger who entrusts us with their safety and dignity. If this can happen to my daughter, the CEO's child, it can happen to anyone. That is unacceptable." Alan nodded, his face pale. "We understand, Mr. Bradley. We've already begun drafting revised protocols. Sensitivity training for all staff will be mandatory, effective immediately. We're also implementing a whistleblower hotline for passengers and crew to report misconduct anonymously." "Good," Marcus replied, leaning forward. "But I'm not stopping there. I want to lead these changes personally. I'll be meeting with the training team, reviewing onboarding processes, and overhauling employee evaluations. If someone like Sarah slipped through the cracks, our system is broken, and it's on us to fix it." The heart of the matter. As the executives discussed timelines and logistics, Leela tugged gently on her father's sleeve. Marcus immediately turned his attention to her, his expression softening. "Daddy," she whispered, "do I have to talk to more people about what happened?" Marcus crouched beside her, placing a comforting hand on her cheek. "Only if you want to, Princess. If you're tired, you can rest. No one will make you do anything you don't want to." Leela hesitated, her small fingers gripping Ruby tighter. "I don't want her to hurt anyone else," she said softly. "But I don't like talking about it." Marcus's heart clenched. He kissed her forehead gently. "You've already done so much, sweetheart. You've been brave enough for all of us. Let me handle the rest, okay?" Leela nodded, her trust in her father absolute. A difficult conversation. After ensuring Leela was settled with a juice box and her tablet, Marcus returned his focus to the executives. He motioned for the legal representative to step forward. "Let's talk about Sarah," Marcus said, his tone leaving no room for ambiguity. "What's the process for termination?" The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses nervously. "Mr. Bradley, the evidence we've gathered from passenger statements and crew testimonies is overwhelming. Her actions constitute gross misconduct, and her employment will be terminated immediately. Additionally, the physical harm caused to your daughter may warrant legal action." Marcus nodded. "Proceed with her termination immediately. As for legal action, I'll make that decision after discussing it with my family. But I want her actions recorded in her employment history. No airline should ever unknowingly hire someone like her again. The HR head, a middle-aged woman named Denise, interjected. We'll ensure that's documented, Mr. Bradley. And we're also revisiting our hiring processes to prevent this from happening again. Good, Marcus said, his voice firm. Because if I find out this wasn't an isolated incident, there will be further consequences. Restoring Lila's confidence. Later that evening, Marcus and Lila were escorted to a luxurious suite at a nearby hotel, courtesy of the airline. Marcus had insisted on skipping the scheduled meetings for the following day. His priority was his daughter's well-being. Once they were settled, Marcus ordered room service, Lila's favorite, pancakes with whipped cream and strawberries. As they sat at the small dining table, Marcus watched Lila carefully. Her usual chatter was subdued, and she seemed to pick at her food rather than devour it as she normally would. Lila, Marcus said gently, can I tell you something? She looked up, her blue eyes questioning. I know today was really hard, he continued, and I know it probably scared you. But I want you to remember something. What happened today doesn't define you. You're brave, you're strong, and you're kind. Those are the things that matter. Lila blinked back tears, her voice trembling. But she said I was spoiled, and that I didn't belong there. Marcus leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. She was wrong, Princess. She said those things because she was angry and mean, not because they were true. You belong anywhere you want to be. Don't let anyone ever make you feel otherwise. Lila hesitated, then gave a small nod. For the first time that evening, she took a big bite of her pancake and smiled faintly. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. The call to action. That night, after Lila had fallen asleep clutching Ruby, Marcus sat by the window, his phone in hand. He composed an email to the airline's board of directors, outlining the events of the day and his plans for immediate reform. The email was direct, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Subject: urgent. Addressing systemic failures in passenger care. Ladies and gentlemen, today my 7-year-old daughter experienced a level of mistreatment on one of our flights that no passenger, especially a child, should ever endure. This incident has revealed significant gaps in our training, employee evaluation, and accountability measures. Effective immediately, I am instituting a comprehensive review of all in-flight operations. I will personally oversee changes to hiring protocols, mandatory sensitivity training, and the establishment of a whistleblower hotline. Additionally, this incident will serve as a case study for future training sessions. Pegasus Airlines was built on a foundation of respect, dignity, and care for every passenger. I will not allow that foundation to be compromised. I expect your full cooperation as we work to ensure this never happens again. Regards, Marcus Bradley, CEO, Pegasus Airlines. The moment of reflection. As Marcus hit send, he looked over at Lila, who was now sleeping peacefully. The day had been one of the most challenging of his life, but it had also reminded him of his purpose, not just as a CEO, but as a father. He was determined to turn this painful experience into something meaningful, ensuring that Pegasus Airlines would become a symbol of safety, kindness, and respect. For Marcus, the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for now, as he watched over his sleeping daughter, he allowed himself a moment of quiet resolve. Justice was in motion, and he would see it through to the end. The journey forward. The morning sun poured through the large windows of their hotel suite, casting a golden glow across the room. Lila stirred on the oversized bed, her stuffed rabbit, Ruby, still tucked under her arm. Marcus sat at the small desk nearby, reviewing the overnight responses to his email from Pegasus Airlines Board of Directors. Every reply was unanimous. Support for his proposed changes and a deep sense of urgency to act. A new day, a new chapter. Daddy, Lila's soft voice broke through the silence. Marcus turned, his face lighting up with a warm smile. Good morning, Princess. Did you sleep well? She nodded, rubbing her eyes. "Are we going home today?" "Yes," Marcus replied, crossing the room to sit beside her. "But before we leave, I wanted to talk to you about something important." Leela tilted her head, her curls bouncing, as she listened attentively. "What is it?" Marcus took her small hands in his. "You know what happened on the plane wasn't okay, right? And you were so brave to tell me. Because you spoke up, we're going to make sure no one else has to go through what you did." "Really?" Lila's eyes widened. "How?" Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with pride at her curiosity. "I'm going to make some big changes at work. Better training for the people who work on our planes, new rules to keep everyone safe, and ways for passengers to tell us if something isn't right. It's all because of you, Princess." Leela's face brightened. "I helped." "You helped a lot," Marcus said, pulling her into a hug. "And I couldn't be prouder of you. A hero's welcome." Later that day, Marcus and Leela arrived at Dallas International Airport to board their return flight. The airline staff, aware of the previous day's incident, went above and beyond to ensure their journey home was seamless. A small team of employees greeted them at the gate with a bouquet of flowers for Leela and a handwritten card apologizing for her experience. Leela accepted the flowers with a shy smile. Marcus, however, was focused on the work ahead. As they walked to the boarding gate, a familiar voice called out, "Mr. Bradley." Marcus turned to see Mrs. Hathaway, the retired school teacher from the previous flight. She held a small envelope in her hand. "Mrs. Hathaway," Marcus greeted warmly. "It's good to see you again. I wanted to give this to your daughter," she said, handing the envelope to Leela. "It's just a little note to remind her how brave she was." Leela opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a card with a hand-drawn rainbow and the words, "Always stand tall, little one. You're stronger than you know." Lila's smile grew as she clutched the card to her chest. "Thank you, Mrs. Hathaway," Marcus said, his voice thick with gratitude. "Your kindness means more than you know." The flight home. The return flight was everything a Pegasus Airlines experience should be: warm, welcoming, and attentive. Lila was treated like royalty by the crew, who made sure she was comfortable and happy throughout the journey. For the first time since the ordeal, she seemed relaxed, even laughing at a movie she watched during the flight. Marcus, seated beside her, couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The storm was subsiding, and the path forward was becoming clearer. A ripple effect. Once they landed, Marcus wasted no time diving into action. He held a series of emergency meetings with the airline's leadership team, outlining a comprehensive plan to rebuild trust with passengers and ensure the highest standards of safety and care. The reforms were far-reaching. Mandatory sensitivity training. Every employee, from flight attendants to senior executives, would undergo regular training to address unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and passenger care. Stricter hiring practices. Background checks would be expanded to include evaluations of interpersonal skills and emotional intelligence. Passenger advocacy team. A dedicated team would be established to handle passenger complaints and feedback swiftly and empathetically. Whistleblower program. Both passengers and employees would have a confidential platform to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Real-time oversight. Cameras and monitoring systems would be implemented in cabins to ensure passenger safety and staff accountability. Marcus personally led the first sensitivity training session, sharing Lila's story to drive home the importance of their mission. "This isn't just about policy," he told the assembled employees. "This is about people, about the trust our passengers place in us. We cannot fail them." Healing the wounds. At home, Marcus focused on helping Leela process what had happened. They spent evenings talking, playing games, and creating new memories to replace the painful ones. Lila's bruises faded, but her resilience grew stronger with every passing day. One night, as they sat on the couch watching her favorite animated movie, Leela turned to Marcus. "Daddy, are you still mad about what happened?" Marcus paused, considering her question. "I was angry," he admitted. "But now, I'm focused on making things better. And you helped me see what needed to change." Leela smiled. "I'm glad I told you." "I am too," Marcus said, wrapping an arm around her. "You taught me something important, Princess. Sometimes, even grown-ups need to be reminded how to do the right thing." The legacy of change. Within months, Pegasus Airlines became a symbol of transformation in the aviation industry. Stories of passengers experiencing exceptional care and kindness began to circulate, and the company's reputation soared. Employees embraced the new training programs, proud to be part of an airline that genuinely prioritized people. Leela's story, shared anonymously during training sessions, became a powerful reminder of the impact of kindness and the consequences of its absence. For Marcus, every success was a testament to his daughter's courage and his commitment to ensuring that Pegasus Airlines lived up to its name, a beacon of strength and hope in the skies. A new beginning. One evening, as Marcus tucked Leela into bed, she looked up at him with her wide, curious eyes. "Daddy," she said, "do you think people will remember what happened?" Marcus smiled, smoothing her curls. "They'll remember what we did about it, Princess, and because of you, they'll know we chose to make things better." Leela grinned sleepily, her trust in her father unwavering. "You're the best, Daddy." Marcus kissed her forehead. "No, sweetheart. You are." As she drifted off to sleep, Marcus sat by her bedside, reflecting on the journey they had taken together. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And as the stars twinkled outside the window, he knew one thing for certain. They were stronger together than any storm life could throw their way. Full circle. The following weeks were a whirlwind of transformation, both at Pegasus Airlines and within Marcus's life as a father. The changes he had implemented began to take root, creating a ripple effect that was felt far beyond the airline. The story of Leela's experience and Marcus's swift actions spread through industry circles, sparking conversations about accountability, kindness, and the importance of creating safe environments for all passengers. A return to the skies. Months later, Leela stood at the airport beside her father, her pink backpack bouncing slightly as she tugged at his hand. They were preparing for their first flight together since the incident. Lila's confidence had grown, and her excitement was once again evident in her bright eyes and wide smile. "Do you think Ruby gets her own seat this time?" she asked, holding up her stuffed rabbit. Marcus chuckled, kneeling to her level. "Ruby might have to share with you, but I promise this trip will be even better than the last one." Leela nodded enthusiastically, her fears replaced with the excitement that should have always been part of flying. Together, they boarded the plane, greeted warmly by a new team of flight attendants who went out of their way to make Leela feel special. As they settled into their seats, Marcus noticed how attentive the crew was, not just to them, but to every passenger. The reforms were working, and he felt a deep sense of pride. Leela, meanwhile, chatted happily with the flight attendant assigned to their row, her laughter filling the cabin. A special announcement. Midway through the flight, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a moment to recognize a very special passenger on today's flight. Leela Bradley, this one's for you. Your courage and kindness inspired changes that have made Pegasus Airlines a better place for everyone. Thank you for reminding us all what it means to be brave." Leela's cheeks flushed with surprise and delight as the passengers around her clapped. Marcus leaned over, his voice soft. "See, Princess, your bravery made a difference." Leela beamed, clutching Ruby tightly. "I think Ruby helped too," she whispered. The final touch. When the plane landed, the first-class cabin filled with the usual flurry of passengers gathering their belongings. As they prepared to disembark, the flight attendant handed Leela a small envelope. "This is from the entire Pegasus Airlines team," she said with a warm smile. "We wanted you to know how much you mean to us." Leela opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a hand-drawn card featuring a plane soaring through the clouds, along with the words, "To Leela, thank you for helping us fly higher." She looked up at Marcus, her eyes shining. "I love flying with you, Daddy." Marcus smiled, lifting her into his arms as they exited the plane. "And I love flying with you, Princess." The legacy of Layla's story. As Marcus and Leela stepped into the terminal, he reflected on how far they had come. The changes at Pegasus Airlines were more than just policies. They were a commitment to a culture of care and respect. Lila's story had sparked something powerful, something lasting, and Marcus knew it was only the beginning. For Leela, the experience was a lesson in resilience and the power of speaking up. For Marcus, it was a reminder that leadership wasn't just about managing a company. It was about protecting the people who placed their trust in it. As they walked hand in hand toward their next adventure, Marcus knew one thing for certain. The skies were brighter now, not just for them, but for everyone who would fly with Pegasus Airlines in the years to come. And as Leela looked up at him, her face full of joy, she whispered, "Daddy, I think we're ready for another adventure." Marcus smiled. "Always, Princess, always." With that, they walked into the future, their bond unbreakable, their journey just beginning, and their story of bravery, justice, and love, a legacy for others to follow.